The Western Crusade against Fascism. How did Axis aggression, fascist atrocities, and the stresses of total war impress itself upon historical contemporaries and inspire a global reform movement? The Western powers, namely Britain and the United States, the sole unconquered remaining democratic great powers, cast their war effort as a crusade to preserve liberal democracy. In this framing of World War II as a moral crusade, Hitler, Nazism, the forcing of war upon reluctant neighbors, the brutalization of civilians, Hitlerism in general was foisted upon, elevated as an evil to rally Western civilization. So ordinary citizens were exhorted to sacrifice, and of course, neutral nations were rallied to the cause, and among the British Empire, countries like Canada were mobilized in the war effort to fight a war for this moral cause. Now, the beginning of this intellectual framing of World War II as a moral crusade was really the Atlantic Charter, which took place just outside of Newfoundland, as Churchill and FDR met in secret. And Churchill, of course, was very disappointed in this meeting because he had hoped that this meeting would crystallize in America abandoning its neutrality position and firmly coming on board to support the British war effort, if not as a formal belligerent, at least in terms of more overt military and material support. Instead, what he was greeted with was essentially a document which was entitled A Joint Declaration, had been written by the Americans, which invoked some of Churchill's earlier ideas in discourse as he tried to rally the British people against the Nazis, and a war effort which seemed to have little prospect of success, but which offered nothing actually tangibly to the British war effort. Nonetheless, once Churchill and FDR came back, journalists hailed the Joint Declaration as an Atlantic Charter, essentially elevating it to a magna carta, essentially casting World War II as a battle between good and evil, where the Western states were fighting for the continuation of Western civilization to prevent it from falling into barbarism, the barbarism that Hitler was trying to cast over the world and to usher in another dark age. So if we look at the Atlantic Charter, which again is just a really short document, about a page and a half, it's essentially making this moral argument that the Axis powers had forced this war upon the Western states, that had done everything to reasonably accommodate their demands. That the war was fundamentally a clash of civilizations between good and evil, or in other words, between liberal democracy, Christian civilization, and barbarism and militarism and Hitlerism. And one of the arguments made in the Atlantic Charter is, despite how desperate things look and Hitler was triumphant on the European continent, ultimately the Allies were going to prevail and liberate people from Nazi tyranny. So in a sense, what this was, the Atlantic Charter was, again, essentially a liberal statement that the world would be rehabilitated ultimately. It was articulating the values for which Western powers and the neutral nations should aspire to uphold. Now, the mighty Wehrmacht was ultimately defeated by this combination of Russian manpower and American industrial might, and essentially a two-front war that grounded the military superior Wehrmacht into the ground. But Stalin had started World War II as Hitler's ally and partner in crime, really, in the way that he backstabbed Poland and invaded the Baltic states and Finland. So from the Allied point of view, the Western point of view, Hitler was just another form of dictator. He was a bandit state just like Japan, Italy, and Germany, and part of their alliance originally until he was forced to turn against Germany because they had invaded him. So what we see is that during World War II, the Atlantic Charter is, essentially a liberal statement in which, obviously the Anglo-Americans and their special relationship, they can easily agree. But ultimately what they have to do is to incorporate Stalin, a communist state with fundamentally different values and war aims, into their coalition. And Churchill ultimately termed this the Grand Alliance, but that was essentially souped up language to kind of paper over the very fundamental differences between Stalin and the West. Nonetheless, they needed each other. They needed each other to destroy Nazism. So they had to form an alliance, and this meant also coming to an understanding about how they were going to wage the war and defining the values that they were fighting for and the structure of the world once the fighting was over. Now, initially, the Atlantic Charter and the Atlantic Spirit and this idea of rallying the United Nations to redeem the world, these were idealistic statements. They seem far off, not only Germany was triumphant and making great progress in Russia, but Japan was running amok and easily conquered an empire that stretched essentially over, the entire South Pacific. But from 1942 to 43, the war started to turn from the Axis side to the Allied side. First, the Allies essentially grounded and stopped the Axis advance, giving themselves a lease on life, and then they began to turn the tide. Now, I'm not going to go into World War II in detail, and I know most of you have had a lot of this history already. But essentially, 42 to 43 is the turning of the war, whether it was the Battle in the Atlantic to secure British lifelines, whether it was the Battle of Midway, in which essentially Japan lost all initiative in the Pacific, the Battle of El Alamein that prevented Germany from striking into the Middle East and potentially hooking up with Japan, or the Battle of Stalingrad, which permanently put Germany on defensive on the Russian front, or the American landing in North Africa that began essentially the grinding of the Wehrmacht on two fronts. In the process of this, the Atlantic Charter, Atlantic Spirit, all this language was no longer some idealistic statement, but increasingly it was emerging as an informal blueprint in terms of how the Allies, who are now likely to win the war, were going to use these principles to restructure the international system and to redraw international boundaries. Now, many historians have said that, the Yalta Conference was the beginning of the Cold War. Certainly what we can say is that the chill of Yalta, the coldness between Stalin and the West, which you can see in this famous picture of the Yalta Conference, manifested into a gulf between Stalin and the West that was never bridged. Now, what's ironic is that, essentially Germany was all but defeated. Japan had lost all room of maneuver. And it was for this reason, really, that the differences between the Stalin and the West that had been papered over really came to fruition. Because now was approaching the time where the Allies were going to have to sit down and implement the peace. So the differences that they had papered over as they were focused on the war effort and destroying their mutual enemy came to the fore. So Yalta was very contentious. I'm not going to go into all the details in this particular slide because we'll talk about it later. But the significance of Yalta is that the unity between Stalin and the West at least stayed together. And Stalin at least endorsed the Atlantic values, at least in words, if not in deed, so that the alliance came together. They met on the Elbe River. They subdued Germany. And they were now in a position to act upon their vision for a better future. Now, probably most of you have been to some pretty wild parties, but you haven't seen anything like VE Day. If you can imagine yourself on Yonge Street or Piccadilly Circus or in the Netherlands, I mean, they love the Canadians. They were their liberators that saved them from 5 years of Nazi occupation and the Oorlogswinter, the bitter last winter when so many people went very hungry and even starved to death. So when the war ended, I mean, it was just a spontaneous exuberance. Everyone was partying, kissing random people, drinking like crazy. And, then there was the next morning, the hangovers. You woke up and the reality set in. Yeah, the war was over. There was still a lot of unresolved business. There was still fighting going on in the East. There was still fighting going on in the Pacific. And wow, the damage that people were left with and just the evil that had driven this war, it created this kind of dark cloud that people had to get through. So there was this exuberance the night before, and then kind of in the next following months, it was kind of the more grim prospecting of how difficult it would be to set the clock back to 1939, if that was even possible. So one of the things I've tried to do is to kind of give you the intellectual history of the Atlantic Charter and how the Western Allied powers tried to frame World War II as a moral crusade against Fascism. So now it comes time to kind of evaluate this history. I have a poll that you can answer, but as you're looking at the module, you can potentially think of this on your own terms. To what extent was the Allied framing of World War II as a moral crusade just kind of self-serving propaganda, a way to brandish the enemy as an evil state to rally the people, or did it contain a kernel of truth that these Axis states were fundamentally radical powers that were animated by these ideas like living space and Vernichtingskrieg, annihilation warfare, brutalized civilians. So in that context, it gave the Allies the opportunity to define the war as a moral struggle and provided them a language that enabled them to rally their people who had earlier been very reluctant to go to war, to sacrifice again to ensure that they would win.